Hello, I'm Glen Scrivener. We're in Exodus chapters 1 to 3, thinking about the burning bush. Do you have a Bible? Why don't you grab a Bible and we'll follow along. Let me open by asking you this question. Where is God in a world full of suffering? Where is God in the midst of a world so full of pain? It's a question that's asked by non-Christians, and it's a question that's asked by Christians as well. And the burning bush is at the heart of the Bible's answer to that question. You know, the burning bush, almost the emblem of the Exodus. Here in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2, we see Moses. He sees the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Later on, Moses is amazed to see that the bush was on fire, verse 2, but it did not burn up. So in some ways it could be called the non-burning bush as well. But this burning bush, or this non-burning bush, is right at the heart of God's answer to the suffering question. Let me explain by giving you some context. Do you know the context to the book of Exodus? Here we are in chapter 1, and there are 70 descendants from Jacob who come into Egypt. And then we read in verse 8, there is a new king in Egypt who did not know about Joseph, that great governor of the land of Egypt back in the day. This new king forgets about Joseph, and so here comes the suffering. In verse 11, Pharaoh says, let's put slave masters over them. It's chilling, really. Here is the first time that a great leader has said, let's put the Jews in the labor camps. It's horrifyingly familiar, but it is an ancient story. Then Pharaoh steps up the persecution in verse 15. He brings things up to genocide, commanding the Hebrew midwives to kill all the boy children of the Israelites. He steps it up even further in verse 22. Here is Pharaoh's final solution. Verse 22, every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Here is some horrific suffering. And where is God in the midst of it? Well, actually, you see all the way throughout Exodus, God is working in the midst of this suffering. The more that Pharaoh tries to stamp out God's people, the more they multiply and grow and spread. There was an ancient saying of the early church that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You beat Christians down and they spring up all the more. God is at work through this suffering, and he does something that he so often does in the midst of suffering. He raises up a ruler. Chapter 2, we see about the birth of Moses. Can you imagine yourself in Moses' mother's shoes? She has to let her boy go for fear that he will be caught up in the genocide. And so she lets him go in the papyrus basket, chapter 2, verse 3. You could say she lets him go in the ark, this ark of salvation. That's literally what the word is in the Hebrew. And this boy is found by Pharaoh's daughter. He gets raised by his own birth mother, but also raised in the Egyptian court. So he knows the ancient promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. But he's also schooled in the wisdom of the Egyptians. And at this point you might think, I know what God's going to do. In the midst of suffering, he's going to raise up Moses, and Moses, through political influence, is going to wheedle his way up through the ranks, and he's going to bring deliverance through political power. Is that the way that God's going to work? Actually, no. Or perhaps you might think that Moses is going to bring about a great coup. This is kind of what Moses thought he was going to do. In verse 11, Moses grew up and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Verse 12, glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. We learn from Acts chapter 7 that Moses hoped that this would be the first act in an uprising of the slaves. Well, if that was Moses' plan, somebody forgot to tell the rest of the Israelites because they don't want to know. They don't want to know about this Moses. Verse 14, who made you ruler and judge over us, Moses? And so Moses is afraid. He's doubly afraid when, verse 15, Pharaoh hears about all of this and he tries to kill Moses. So all of a sudden, Moses is public enemy number one in the greatest kingdom on earth. He's on the run. And we see in verse 15, he flees out into the wilderness. He goes to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Can you imagine Moses there in the midst of the well? Can you imagine him slumped, thinking, I had my chance and I ruined it. I had my chance and I let it go. Surely he was thinking, the way God's going to act is through my strength, through my political power, through my military might, somehow through cunning, through wit. Somehow we're going to get this revolt of the slaves going, and it doesn't work, and he's a failure, aged 40 years old. He slumps there in the wilderness, and we learn that he spends another 40 years there in the wilderness. Can you imagine what a failure he would have felt? Aged 40, aged 50, aged 60, aged 70, aged 80, living with the regrets of how he had failed to liberate God's people. What's God going to do about it? What's God going to do about it? Well, that's the answer to this suffering question. It's not about what we can do about suffering. Moses' hope and our hope is in the gods of verse 23, 24, and 25. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help went up to God. Verse 24, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. I love those four verbs. Do you see those four verbs in verses 24 and 25? God heard, God remembered, God looked, and God was concerned about them. Looking back on these events from a few hundred years, the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 63 says, in all their affliction, God too was afflicted. Isaiah chapter 63 verse 9, in all their affliction, God too was afflicted, but he's not just afflicted, he does something about it. Isaiah goes on, God was afflicted and the angel of his presence saved them. He sent somebody. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sent somebody into the midst of this suffering in order to bring them out. And that's the context for the burning bush. Read with me from chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Here we have the burning bush. And really, with the burning bush, we have three elements at play. We've got the bush, we've got the fire, and we've got the one who's in the midst. Firstly, the bush. Throughout the Bible, God's people are described in botanical terms. They are like a vine or a tree or some kind of shrubbery. They're often spoken of in these kinds of terms. And here we've got this bush. The bush is on fire. And throughout the Bible, it looks back on Exodus as a time of a furnace of affliction, a fiery furnace that God's people were going through. So here we have a bush representing God's people. We have the flames of the fire. We have the affliction, the persecution, the suffering. But then the most sweet element of them all, who should show up in the midst of that fiery affliction? But the one who is known, verse 2, as the angel of the Lord. Isaiah, looking back, says he is the angel of God's presence. But there are some other titles for this figure in the burning bush. In verse 4, he's called the Lord. So not only is he of the Lord, he also is the Lord. He is Lord from Lord. Verse 4 also calls him God. He is God from God. Light from light, very God from very God, begotten not made. Do these words sound familiar from the Creed? We know who this figure is. In Daniel chapter 3, do you remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? There they are thrown into the fiery furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar looks down into the furnace and he says, "Did I not throw 3 men into the furnace? Why do I see 4 figures walking around unharmed in the fire?" And Nebuchadnezzar says in the Old King James, he says, the 4th figure looks like the Son of God. He looks like the Son of God. A few verses later in Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar calls him God's angel. God's angel, the Son of God. Now, don't think angel. Don't think of some sort of floaty, baby-faced creature. In the Bible, the word angel just means the sent one, the messenger, the sent one. And there are many angels in the Bible. Many times we encounter an angel of the Lord, but here is the angel of the Lord, the sent one from God, the Son of God. The God from God, the light from light, the very God from very God. Verse 14, he calls himself, "I am who I am." And here is the answer to our suffering question. Where is God in suffering? He's right there in the midst, isn't he? He's right there in the midst. Moses looks on this figure, Christ, before he took flesh as our brother. Moses looks on this figure in the burning bush. And listen to these promises that this one declares to Moses from verse 7. This Lord, this Son of God, he says to Moses, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Where is God in the midst of suffering? My friends, in all your affliction, God too is afflicted. And he sends the angel of his presence, the Lord Jesus Christ, into your midst to be with you, to be for you, to suffer alongside you, and then on the cross to take that fiery furnace of judgment on himself. The Lord Jesus, he knows all about suffering. So often people think that suffering rules out the existence of God. They say, how can you believe in God when there's so much suffering in the world? Well, let me level with you. There are a lot of gods out there who have never suffered. There are a lot of gods, therefore, who are ruled out by the existence of suffering, but suffering cannot rule out the existence of this God, the suffering God, the God of the burning bush. Moses looked to this one in the burning bush. We have seen this one on the tree, the cross. And he says to you and I what he said to Moses. Are you going through suffering right now? Let me read these words to you, because this is what the Lord Jesus Christ says to you in the midst of your suffering. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." This is Christ's word to you. He sees your misery. He hears you crying out. He is concerned about your suffering. And he's come down to rescue you, to lift you up, and to bring you into a good and pleasant land.